Welcome to the Alpha Mediumship Academy podcast, a space for intuition, mediumship, and spiritual growth. I'm Elle, and each week we explore conscious development, awareness, and the deeper side of spiritual experience. So wherever you are, settle in and let's begin. Welcome back to the Alpha Mediumship Podcast. I'm Elle, and today we're talking about something every intuitive person, every empath, every developing medium, and honestly, every human being who has ever tried to trust themselves eventually encounters. And that is the question: am I receiving something, or am I making it up? Now, if you've ever asked yourself that question, I want you to know something right away. You're normal. You're not behind. You're not failing. And you're definitely not the only one. In fact, if I had to choose the single most common question I've been asked over the years, it would probably be some version of that exact question. People don't usually come to me and say, "Joy, tell me the secrets of the universe." No. Usually they come and say, "Joy, I got a feeling about something and then I talked myself out of it." Or, "I saw something in my mind and then I convinced myself it wasn't real." Or, "I think I might be intuitive, but I don't know if it's intuition or imagination." And honestly, that's the real work. The real work isn't opening intuition. The real work is learning to recognize it. Because most people are already experiencing intuitive information. They're just dismissing it before they have a chance to understand it. And I want to start by saying something that might surprise you. The goal of this episode is not to help you get rid of imagination. The goal is to help you stop blaming imagination for everything, because imagination has become the villain in a lot of spiritual circles. People talk about imagination as if it's the thing standing between them and their gifts. As if imagination is some kind of spiritual fraud department that exists solely to sabotage their development. And I don't see it that way, not at all. In fact, imagination is one of the most misunderstood tools in intuitive development. And if you understand what imagination actually is, a lot of the fear starts disappearing. So let's begin with something simple. Think about the last dream you had. Not necessarily a dramatic dream, just any dream. Maybe you remember it, maybe you don't. But while you were dreaming, the images felt real enough that your mind engaged with them. You didn't stop in the middle of the dream and say, "Wait a second, is this imagination?" You experienced it. Only afterward did you analyze it. Now, intuition often works similarly. The experience comes first. The analysis comes second. But what most developing intuitives do is reverse the order. They analyze first and experience second. Or worse, they analyze instead of experiencing. They receive an image and immediately interrogate it. They receive a feeling and immediately doubt it. They receive a symbol and immediately reject it. And then they wonder why they feel disconnected. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're sitting quietly. You've got your journal. Maybe you've lit a candle. Maybe you've got a cup of tea. Maybe you're trying very hard to look spiritual. We've all done it. And you ask a question. Maybe the question is, what do I need to know today? And instantly, you see a lighthouse. Just a lighthouse. Now, what happens next? For most people, the lighthouse isn't the problem. The next 10 seconds are the problem because the mind jumps in and says, why a lighthouse? What does that mean? Did I see a lighthouse in a movie recently? Am I thinking about a vacation? Did I make that up? And before long, the lighthouse has disappeared beneath 10 layers of analysis. The original impression is gone, not because it wasn't real, but because it never got a chance to breathe. One of the things I tell my students all the time is this: your first job is observation. Your second job is interpretation. Most people reverse them. And when you reverse them, everything becomes confusing. Imagine a scientist looking through a microscope. The scientist doesn't immediately announce a conclusion. They observe. They gather information. They stay curious. They allow patterns to emerge. And that is exactly how intuitive development works. Not through force, not through urgency, not through desperately trying to be right, but through observation. Now here's where things get interesting, because a lot of people assume psychic information should feel dramatically different from ordinary thoughts. They expect fireworks, angels singing, a dramatic movie soundtrack, some kind of unmistakable certainty. But that's often not how it feels. Sometimes psychic information feels surprisingly ordinary. In fact, one reason people miss it is because it feels too ordinary. It arrives quietly. It slips into awareness. It doesn't always announce itself. And because it feels familiar, people assume it must be imagination. But familiarity does not equal fabrication. Let me say that again. Familiarity does not equal fabrication. Just because something arrived through your own mental screen doesn't automatically mean you created it. Think about hearing a song on the radio. The speaker is in your car. The sound is coming through your speakers. But that doesn't mean your car created the song. Your car is the receiver. And your mind often functions similarly. It's the receiving mechanism. The fact that information arrives through your thoughts does not automatically mean your thoughts generated it. And that distinction changes everything. One of the biggest mistakes beginners make is expecting intuition to feel foreign. They think, if it's real, it shouldn't feel like me. But intuition often feels very much like you because it is moving through your awareness. The difference isn't whether it feels familiar, the difference is how it behaves. And that's what we're going to spend this episode exploring, because once you start paying attention to behavior rather than appearance, everything starts making more sense. Now, I want you to think back to a time when you had a feeling about something. Maybe a person, maybe a decision, maybe a situation, and maybe you ignored it. Most people can think of at least one example. Maybe you walked into a room and immediately felt uncomfortable. Maybe you met someone and something felt off. Maybe you felt strongly drawn toward an opportunity and didn't understand why. At the time, you probably didn't have evidence. You didn't have proof. You didn't have a spreadsheet. You just had a feeling. And then later, something happened that made you look back and say, I knew. Notice what people say. They don't say, I calculated. They don't say, I logically deduced. They say I knew that knowing is one of the languages intuition uses. And yet, when it happens in the moment, people often distrust it. Why? Because the logical mind prefers certainty. Intuition often arrives before certainty, and that's uncomfortable for many people. So, as we continue through this episode, I want you to release one expectation. You do not need to become perfect at distinguishing intuition from imagination overnight. That's not the goal. The goal is awareness. The goal is noticing. The goal is beginning to recognize patterns you've probably been experiencing your entire life, because intuition isn't always something new. Sometimes it's something old that you're finally paying attention to. Okay, so in part one, we started to normalize something really important, that confusion is not a problem, and that most people are already receiving intuitive information. They're just dismissing it before it has a chance to develop. Now, in this section, we need to talk about something that gets misunderstood a lot, and that is imagination. Because I need to be very clear here. Imagination is not the enemy of intuition, but it is often treated like it is. People start spiritual development and suddenly imagination becomes suspicious. Like, oh no, I saw an image in my mind. That must mean I made it up? That must mean it's not real? And I always want to pause there and say, wait. Slow down. Your imagination is not a fraud department. It's not sitting there trying to sabotage your spiritual progress like a little internal trickster whose only job is to confuse you. That is not what it is. Let's actually define it properly. Imagination is your mind's natural symbolic language system. That's it. It is the part of your consciousness that can create images, simulate scenarios, build meaning from fragments, combine memory and emotion into visual form, and explore possibilities that are not physically present. In other words, imagination is your internal meaning maker. And honestly, it's incredibly intelligent. It is not random, it is not fake, it is not less than. It is a core function of how your mind processes reality. Now, let me give you a real example that most people will relate to. Think about worrying. When you worry about something that hasn't happened yet, what is your mind doing? It is imagining. It is building scenarios. It is projecting outcomes. It is creating visual and emotional simulations of possible futures. And nobody says, oh wow, you're just making that up, so it must not matter. No. We take imagination very seriously when it creates anxiety. But the moment imagination shows up in intuition work, suddenly it becomes suspect. That's interesting, right? We trust imagination when it creates fear, but we distrust it when it creates insight. So let's correct something foundational. Imagination is not the opposite of intuition. It is the container intuition often uses. Let me explain that more clearly. Your mind does not receive intuitive information in a separate mystical language that bypasses your psychology. It receives information through your existing cognitive system, which includes memory, imagination, sensory recall, emotional association, symbolic thinking. So when intuitive information arrives, it has to pass through that system. It doesn't bypass it, it uses it. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Because people assume if it's real intuition, it shouldn't use my imagination. But that assumption creates the exact confusion they're trying to avoid. Because what actually happens is intuition arrives first as raw impression, and imagination gives it form. Let me say that again because it's important. Intuition is often the signal, imagination is often the translation. Now, I want to slow this down with a very relatable example. Let's say you're thinking about someone, and suddenly an image pops into your mind of a broken bridge. Now, immediately your mind wants to say, okay, I made that up. Why would I think of a bridge? That doesn't make sense. And you dismiss it. But let's pause. What if that image is not random? What if your mind is using something symbolic to represent a feeling of disconnection, transition, or instability? Now, I'm not saying every bridge means something mystical. That's not the point. The point is, you didn't consciously choose the image. It arrived. That distinction matters. Here's where students usually get stuck. They think, if I didn't consciously choose it, it must be imagination, so it doesn't count. But imagination is not invalid just because it is spontaneous. Spontaneity is actually one of the key characteristics we are watching for in intuitive development. Because controlled thought looks like thinking, but spontaneous imagery often looks like receiving. Now, I want to give you something very practical. These are two types of imagination we need to separate. Number one, directed imagination. This is where you are intentionally creating something. For example, visualizing your future, imagining a conversation, daydreaming on purpose, problem solving. This is active imagination. You are steering it. Number two, spontaneous imagination. This is when something appears without being asked for. An image, a word, a feeling, a scene. No effort, no direction, just appearance. Now here is the key. Spontaneous imagination is the category most people confuse with intuition. Not because it is automatically psychic, but because it is not consciously generated. And the mind tends to assume, if I didn't create it, it must mean something. And that assumption is where confusion begins. So let's make this very grounded. Spontaneous imagination is simply material that arises from deeper layers of your mind. Sometimes it is memory. Sometimes it is emotion. Sometimes it is intuition. Sometimes it is a symbolic processing. And part of your training is learning not to immediately assign a category, because labeling too early interrupts the signal. Let me give you a very real teaching moment I've seen with students. A student once told me, I keep seeing a yellow flower every time I try to practice, but I think I'm just making it up. And I asked her, okay, but did you choose the yellow flower? And she said, no, it just appears. And I said, good, that's the part we pay attention to. Not because it automatically means something spiritual, but because it is unselected content. It is emerging without conscious direction. That is what we observe. Now, I want to pause here and say something very important. You do not need to immediately assign meaning to everything you perceive. In fact, that is one of the biggest blocks to development because meaning making too early creates distortion. It's like trying to read a book while someone is still writing it. You end up guessing the ending before the story exists. So, here's your new training principle. First observe, Then notice repetition. Then notice emotional tone. Then allow meaning to emerge later, not immediately. Now, I want to normalize something else. Even experienced intuitives still use imagination constantly. They just stop confusing it with failure. They learn, oh, my mind is showing me a symbolic image. Not, oh no, I made that up so I should ignore it. That shift alone changes everything. Because the goal is not to eliminate imagination. The goal is to become fluent in it, to recognize when it is random processing, when it is emotional processing, when it is symbolic communication, and when it may be intuitive signal. But none of that is decided in the first second. That is the trap. So I want to leave you with a simple reflection for this section. Next time something appears in your mind unexpectedly, instead of asking, did I make that up? Try asking, did I choose this? Or did it arrive? And then pause. Don't answer immediately. Just observe the quality of it. Because intuition doesn't require instant interpretation. It requires space. Okay, now we're getting into the part of this topic where everything either becomes very clear or very messy. And that depends on one thing, whether you can tell the difference between intuition and anxiety while it's happening. Because once anxiety enters the system, everything starts to look like everything else. Imagination looks like intuition. Intuition looks like anxiety. Thoughts look like messages. Messages look like fear. And suddenly, everything is one big internal blur. So, let's slow this all the way down because I want you to really understand something foundational here. Most confusion in intuitive development is not actually psychic confusion. It is nervous system confusion. Let me say that again. It is not that your intuition is unclear. It is that your nervous system is activated. It changes how everything is perceived. Now, let's define 3 states very clearly again. Intuition, imagination, anxiety. And I want you to notice something important. All 3 of these show up in the same language. Thoughts, images, sensations, feelings. So the difference is not the format. The difference is the quality underneath it. Let's talk about anxiety first, because anxiety is sneaky. It doesn't announce itself like, hello, I am anxiety, and I'm here to distort your intuition today. It feels like urgency. It feels like importance. It feels like this matters. Pay attention right now, even when nothing is actually happening. Here's what anxiety tends to feel like internally: rapid thoughts, looping scenarios, a sense of something is wrong, but I don't know what. Pressure to figure it out immediately. Emotional escalation when you focus on it. And here's the key. Anxiety always wants resolution. It cannot tolerate uncertainty. So it pushes you toward conclusion fast, even if the conclusion is wrong. Now, compare that to intuition. Intuition does not behave like that. Intuition does not say, figure this out immediately or something bad will happen. Intuition is more like, here is information. Notice it. That's it. No urgency, no pressure, no emotional escalation. So, one of the simplest distinctions you can learn is this. Anxiety demands action. Intuition offers awareness. If something is pushing you toward urgency, it is almost never intuition. It is activation. Now, I want to give you a real life example because this is where people recognize themselves. Let's say you're doing a reading or even just thinking about your life, and suddenly you feel tightness in your chest, a sinking feeling in your stomach, an image of a storm, a thought like something is wrong. Now the mind jumps in immediately. Oh no, this is a warning. This means chaos. This means something bad is coming. And suddenly the entire experience becomes emotional. But let's slow it down. What actually happened? You had, number one, a body sensation. Number two, a mental image. Number three, an emotional interpretation. And the interpretation came last, but it feels like it came first. That's the illusion anxiety creates. It makes interpretation feel like perception. Now, here's the correction point. None of those elements are conclusions. They are raw material. Body sensation equals data. Image equals symbol. Emotion equals energy movement. But meaning is not automatic. Meaning is something that forms when you are calm enough to observe it. And this is where people go wrong. They try to resolve the experience immediately. They say, this means X, or this means Y, or I need to figure this out now. And in doing that, they collapse the signal too early. One of the most important skills in intuitive development is this. You must be able to hold not knowing longer than your anxiety wants you to. That is the skill, not certainty, not speed, not instant interpretation, but tolerance for not knowing. Because clarity does not come from urgency. Clarity comes from stability. Now, I want to address something I hear constantly. People say, I used to be intuitive, but I lost it. And I always want to gently reframe that. You did not lose it. You became more self-monitoring. Let me explain. At some point, usually after a few confusing experiences, people start doing this. Analyzing every thought, questioning every image, checking every feeling, trying to verify everything instantly. And what happens is the intuitive signal gets interrupted mid-flow. Not because it disappeared, but because it is constantly being evaluated. Imagine trying to have a conversation with someone, but every time they speak a sentence, you interrupt them and say, wait, was that correct? Can you prove that? Where did that come from? Eventually, they stop speaking, not because they have nothing to say, but because the environment is not safe for expression. That is what happens internally. Now, let's talk about imagination again, but in the context. Because imagination behaves very differently when anxiety is present. Under anxiety, imagination becomes catastrophic, repetitive, future-focused, emotionally charged, looping. It starts creating scenarios like, what if this means something bad? What if I miss something important? What if I'm wrong? And suddenly, imagination is no longer creative. It becomes predictive fear. And this is where people get confused because they think, I'm getting intuitive messages. But what they are actually experiencing is anxiety using imagination to simulate outcomes. So here is your anchor. Intuition feels quiet. Anxiety feels loud. Imagination feels creative. But anxiety-driven imagination feels like spiraling narrative. Let's walk through a very real situation. You feel anxious about a decision. You ask for guidance. You see an image of water, and immediately your mind says, water means emotional overwhelm. This is a warning. I shouldn't do this. and you stop. But later, nothing actually confirms that interpretation. What happened? You didn't receive wrong information. You interpreted through activation. This is the most important distinction in the entire episode. Most wrong intuition is not wrong signal. It is early interpretation under emotional charge. So now I want to give you the real skill. It is not figure it out faster. It is stay with it longer without deciding what it is. So when something appears internally, image, word, sensation, feeling, your job is not to decode it immediately. Your job is to notice. Did it arrive on its own? Does it change when I analyze it? Does it repeat or stabilize? Does it escalate into fear? This is the real evaluation, not meaning. Pattern behavior. And I want to say this clearly. You do not have to get it right immediately to be intuitive. You just have to stop collapsing the experience too early. Okay, so we've walked through a lot in this episode, and if your mind feels a little full right now, that's okay. Because what we're really doing here is not learning something new. We're reorganizing something you already experience every single day. So let's bring everything back into one place very simply, very clearly, without overcomplicating it. You have 3 internal systems that we've talked about: intuition, imagination, anxiety. And the biggest mistake people make is thinking they need to choose one and eliminate the others. But that is not how this works. They are not enemies, they are functions. Imagination is your internal creative processor. It builds meaning, symbols, scenarios, and possibilities. It is constantly working, even when you are not aware of it. Intuition is your perceptual awareness system. It brings forward information that feels like it arrives into your awareness, not forced, not constructed, but noticed. Anxiety is your protective alert system. It scans for threat, uncertainty, and unresolved meaning. It tries to keep you safe by creating urgency, and when no urgency is actually required. Now, here's the part that changes everything. All 3 use the same internal language: thoughts, images, sensations, emotions. So the difference is never the format. The difference is the behavior underneath it. Let's simplify this even further, because I want this to actually land for you in real life. Anxiety behaves like urgency without clarity, looping thoughts, emotional escalation, pressure to resolve immediately. Something is wrong, but I don't know what. It pulls you inward and tightens your awareness. Imagination behaves like creativity, expansion, storytelling, shifting symbols, exploration. It plays, it builds, it experiments. Intuition behaves like simple awareness, quiet clarity, low emotional charge, stable impression, non-urgent knowing. It does not push you. It does not chase you. It simply arrives. Now, I want to pause here because this alone is enough for most people to start recognizing patterns in their daily life. Now, I'm going to say something very important, and it might sound almost too simple, but simplicity is the point. You do not need to get better at interpreting intuition. You need to get better at not interrupting it. That is the skill. Most people think intuition training is about becoming more accurate, but in reality, it is about becoming less reactive, less quick to decide, less quick to label, less quick to dismiss. Because intuition is not fragile, but it is subtle, and subtle things require space. Now let's correct a very important misunderstanding. A lot of people think if it uses imagination, it must not be intuition. But that is not true. In real intuitive experience, they often work together. Here is what actually happens. Intuition arrives as a raw impression. Imagination gives it form. Anxiety sometimes tries to interpret it too early. And your awareness is what determines clarity. So you are not trying to separate them completely. You are learning to recognize what is arriving, what is shaping it, and what is reacting to it. That is the real skill. Let me give you a very real example. Let's say you are sitting quietly. You ask for guidance, and you see a red umbrella. That's it. No explanation, no context, just a red umbrella. Now the mind immediately wants to do what it always does. What does that mean? Is that protection? Is that emotion? Is that random? Did I just make that up? And this is where most people lose the thread because they try to finish the message immediately. But intuition often does not arrive as a finished sentence. It arrives as a fragment. And fragments require patience, not analysis. So instead of forcing meaning, you observe. Did it arrive on its own? Did it feel stable for a moment? Did it change when I started thinking? Did it change when I started overthinking it? Did anything repeat? That is how you build discernment, not through instant interpretation, but through observation over time. Now here's something I want you to really hear. Confidence in intuition does not come from always being right. It comes from recognizing the difference between signal and noise more consistently. You are not trying to eliminate noise. You are learning not to confuse noise for failure. And this is where everything softens for people. Because they realize, oh, I wasn't broken. I was just reacting too quickly. So let's bring this to a very simple closing truth. If you take everything from this episode and reduce it down to its core essence, it would be this. Intuition is not something you force. Imagination is not something you fear. Anxiety is not something you obey. You learn to notice all three without collapsing them into immediate meaning. And over time, something very natural happens. You stop asking, was that real? And you start noticing, that felt different from my usual thinking. And that is the beginning of real intuitive clarity. So I want to leave you with this. If you've been doubting yourself or second guessing what you receive, or feeling like you're not intuitive enough, I want you to soften that pressure because most of what you're calling lack of intuition is actually just too much interruption, too much analysis, too much urgency. And intuition doesn't disappear under that. It just gets quieter. Not gone, just waiting. So let this be your practice going forward. Notice, pause, don't rush meaning. Let things reveal themselves over time, because they will. They always do. And you don't need to become someone different to access this. You just need to stop interrupting yourself long enough to hear what's already there. Thank you for being here with me today. If this resonated with you, you can continue your development through Alpha Mediumship Academy using the link in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. And just remember, you're probably perceiving more clearly than you think. You're just learning how to trust it. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and trust yourself a little more than you did yesterday.